You'll see the slides up there say Accenture Federal Services, and so I'm actually in a point of transition. So for the last 4 years, I've been a professor at Johns Hopkins University. So there's my Johns Hopkins slide. And as of this week, I'm now Chief Data Scientist for Accenture Federal Services. So I'm leaving academia and going into the corporate sector. So that means that I can help you with your consulting and any of your other needs, right? Okay, so we're going to be talking about strategic influence in online networks, and so I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'm just going to share with you some findings from my research, and hopefully that spurs some questions, discussions, and we can chat. So the story I want to show you is one of social media influence, contested influence online. And so I don't know if you guys are familiar with Nestle, all right, a great chocolate company, and Greenpeace, a activist group. So there was a time when Greenpeace wanted Nestle to stop buying palm oil from an Indonesian vendor and accused them of destroying rainforests and hurting the poor little orangutans, and they did a 2008 protest, and it was ineffective. They actually filed legal charges against Nestle, and Nestle was cleared of any wrongdoing. So in 2010, they used a different tactic, and they created this parody video where if you see they've copied the logo Killer Bars instead of Kit Kat, and they had this really dumb video. It's really boring. I don't recommend watching it, of a guy opening a Kit Kat bar, and then there's like a bloody orangutan finger in there. So this video had less than about 1,000 views, and so Nestle, not liking the video, they cited copyright violations. So what do you think happened when they cited copyright violations and YouTube was forced to take it down? Well, it went from 1,000 views to 400 million views and had a 400,000% increase in viewership after they censored the video and took it down. They had 110,000 new fans to their Facebook page, not because they wanted to like Nestle, but they wanted to post hate mail to their Facebook page. And so we learn our first insight into online influence, which is censorship increases virality, right? So censorship is a great way to get your product seen. So Nestle then decided they were going to start countering this because this is, they were cleared in a court, and so they have all the facts on their side about what a responsible company they are. So they start using a lot, rhetorical persuasion, ethos, pathos, logos to, convince the populace that they're a good company, and it didn't work, right? People got outraged at Nestle's response, and they started getting, at the peak, a hate message on average every 90 seconds for about 3 weeks. So lesson number 2 is that facts and rhetoric are an ineffective means of persuasion, right? Nobody wants to listen to your facts. Our first speaker, Nico, had mentioned the same thing, right? That the facts and rhetoric aren't what creates a persuasive effect. So the issue went viral on Twitter. The content focused a lot on the censorship as much as the issue, and then it eventually got picked up by the mainstream media. And what's interesting here is it's once it got picked up by the mainstream media that it then had some real effect. And what was that? The stock price dropped, and so Nestle stopped buying their palm oil from Saint-Germain, and Greenpeace wins, which helps us with lesson number 3. You can have strategic or operational success online if you're Greenpeace, right? So that's an example of activism working. The interesting thing is that the sales of Nestle chocolate during this campaign were up 4.5% year on year, which means that while this negative campaign was going on, people weren't going, oh my gosh, I love the poor little orangutans. They were like, you know what, those Kit Kats are pretty tasty. I think I'm going to go buy some chocolate, right? And so the last point there is that commercial vendors have been unable to relate social media metrics to any kind of strategic level objectives. Right? So just because we look at the number of tweets or the number of volumes or all these metrics that are thrown out there doesn't mean that they are correlated in any meaningful way with things that we actually care about. Right? So volume is not equal to effect. So what do we do about this, right? So I highlight these 4 lessons, and part of the reason for this story was when I looked at certain like Western government response to misinformation, disinformation, we see their strategy is, first of all, let's censor all the ISIS content or the Russian content. Let's censor it. Well, that to me says it will increase its viewership. We try and get well-crafted facts that we can say of how right we are and what is the truth. Yet that has no effect on persuading anybody, and in fact might actually create the boomerang effect. And we can achieve strategic success online if we actually did it in a more thoughtful way. And then the metrics we use are poor metrics for actually understanding what we are hoping to achieve. So what do I want to talk about? Today I want to talk a little bit about understanding how influence actually works, and I'm going to draw on some neuroscience research that I've done. And I'm going to talk about it at the cognitive neural level. I'm going to talk about it from the social group level, from the efficacy of people, and then talk a little bit about some effective data science and how we can actually get some meaningful data and how we use that to impact our decisions. So I asked the question, how many practitioners in this space can articulate a single model of behavior change? Right, and it's surprising to me of how many people in supposedly in this professional space, when you ask them, can you tell me a single model of behavior change? You get a stare in, deer in the headlight look, right? There's no response. And so I've thrown up some of the most popular ones there along the bottom, and I would say that if you're in this space of trying to persuade people and you don't know these theories across the bottom of the slide, then you are you're way behind the curve, and you probably need to go pick up Daniel O'Keefe's book on theory, persuasion, research, something along those lines, and read it. It's probably the most succinct text on these models. I'm going to talk about one in particular, social judgment theory. If you're familiar with this, I apologize. At least you can see the way I present it. But I just want to articulate one model of behavior change to help illustrate the boomerang effect. And so our first speaker mentioned that sometimes when you throw out facts and information, people actually become more entrenched in their views. So when you tell them they're wrong, they actually become more polarized in the opposite direction. And the theory that helps us understand that is social judgment theory. So I'm going to give you a notional example. Like, what is your view on the death penalty for criminals, right? So here's a range of options that you might have, right? Ranging from you give them a reward to death by torture and somewhere in between, right? So these are just some views people might have. And I'm going to put some scale there to it. And I'm going to throw up a notional person's view, right? So this particular person, that area in green called the latitude of acceptance, these are the range of views that person thinks is reasonable. And this person thinks that they should either be life without parole or death, but they're going to reject the idea that they should be tortured. That's that person's view. And they're also going to reject the idea that they would get 20 years in prison or less. But if you said life with the possibility of parole at some point in the future, well, this is this latitude of non-commitment, right? So there's an area where they're like, okay, we can talk, but I don't agree with you. So now let me throw another person out there. The latitude of rejection here is a little higher. So this person, their view is that there should be life with the possibility of parole, and they're willing to discuss lesser sentences or life without parole. They're going to reject death, the death penalty, and they're going to reject trivial punishments, right? So these are two people. So how does this person on the left try to persuade the person on the right to take a tougher stance? Well, conventional wisdom would be that you need to look at their anchor point, right? So that's their view, and you need to deliver persuasive arguments in the direction you want them to go. Well, what we find with social judgment theory is when those arguments land in the latitude of rejection, the anchor actually shifts in the opposite direction, and that's a pretty robust finding. So the goal in messaging is to figure out where those latitudes of acceptance, non-commitment, and rejection are, and try and land your arguments in the latitude of non-commitment, because they'll actually listen to those values and entertain them. Okay, I'm going to explain what happens in the brain as this process is going on. So this is a slightly complex model, but I'll give you a little bit more example later. But that green area is what we would call self-integration. And there's a couple areas of your brain that become active when you are integrating new information. One's right here in the middle of your forehead, which I think is fascinating, right? And we find that when people have activation in this part of the brain, it's highly correlated with behavior change. And I will give you an example of that on the next slide. It may or may not be correlated with self-reported change. So people, the more a process is subconscious, the more, like if I'm going to ask you, what gender you are, right? You probably are just going to tell me. That's a very conscious thing to think about, right? Or, what's your favorite color? You probably would just tell me. That's the easiest way to do it. But as things become more subconscious, more talking about emotion, more or less conscious processes, then we find that neural imaging actually provides greater insight than self-reported answers for those responses. So we find that this area, when it's active, highly correlated with a behavior change of an ad or whatever. Now, when you are presented with information that's outside of your latitude of acceptance, another area of your brain gets active, and it's right here in the right lateral prefrontal cortex. And this area is counter-arguing, where you start mounting a logical response as to why you're going to dismiss the information just been presented to you. Now, I imagine many of you might have been in a significant relationship with a partner at some point, and imagine the scenario where you have an argument with your partner, and as that argument is getting heated, you think that, hey, the next thing I'm going to say to her, she's going to be like, oh, honey, you're absolutely right. I didn't have that information. Please forgive me. You're completely right. I was so wrong. Which you're all laughing because that happens never in the history of arguments to anybody, right? Because what's happening is, as you're giving her all these factual information about how awesome you are and how right you are, the area in her right lateral prefrontal cortex gets more and more active as she keeps coming up with reasons why you're a jerk, right? And that negative that dashed line indicates a negative correlation. So when this area gets active, it shuts down the ability to integrate any new information, right? So you're unable to process that. So as you are presented with rhetorical persuasion, if that rhetorical persuasion, ethos, pathos, logo, is arguing what you already believe in, then it's very effective at increasing activation here. You'll accept that information. But if it's opposed to what you think, it activates the counter-arguing area of your brain and shuts down your ability to get this new information. So what do you do? Well, there are three known ways to disrupt counter-arguing. One is affirmation. Affirmation has some other areas it's a little harder to measure, but it's in, it's kind of like behind the eyes, a little bit more in the brain. It's like where you have the reward circuit in the brain. So that affirmation will actually disrupt. It's negatively correlated with counter-arguing. It's hard to argue against somebody that's praising you and telling you how great you are, right? We also have distraction and narrative. So when you are getting into a narrative, when you're thinking about the mental states of others, when you're kind of empathizing with people, this area a little bit further up your brain gets active, and that also shuts down counter-arguing. And those two things promote message integration. And so we have this neural basis then for understanding how stories and narrative, how positive affirmation actually promotes message adoption or influence. Okay, so that's the neural basis. Here's an example I told you I would show you. This is from Emily Falk and colleagues. Emily is at University of Pennsylvania. She did a study with tobacco ads. And so she asked people to self-report how effective, these are the perceived effectiveness of 3 different tobacco ads, A, B, and C. Everybody liked B, thought C was a bit of a stinker. And then she measured them under fMRI scans to see where the neural response would be in this area of the brain. And so you see a very different story. And then they were released at 3 different times in Los Angeles, and you see that the actual, the ads were trying to get people to call a 1-800-QUIT-NOW ad for quitting smoking. And you see that the call volume matched the neural response to ads much more than they did the self-reported findings. And there's been other studies, that's just one example of several different studies that have been done similar to that. My work has been more focused in Amman, Jordan. I've done a lot of work with public health ads, so looking at ads that have been aired in Jordan and Egypt for anti-smoking, family planning, and there was another one, I forget what it was. So we actually had measures of effectiveness. Did we have increased contraceptive sales? Did we have decreased tobacco sales? So then we went and found the same people that were either tailored for the messages or not, and able to find the similar findings in their neural response to that data. One of my more recent projects last year was I recruited 100 highly sectarian Sunni and Shia Iraqis in Jordan and showed them counter-sectarianism videos to see if we could identify neural regions that were associated with reduced sectarianism. And one of my more recent ones is on tobacco ads. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And so what I'm doing is using a much more portable system. So you see this is the neural imaging machine right here. It's about this size, and you can hook people up so you can get a lot more ecological validity in the field. Some of the tobacco work I'm doing is looking at the efficacy of tobacco ads. And so this is a study where we showed a bunch of teenage girls tobacco ads in the US. And so there's 10 ads. And we're able to kind of measure a couple key regions. One is approach or disgust, right? So that's measured by kind of an asymmetric difference in the frontal poles. And then measuring that counter-arguing, which you see displayed left to right. And so the ads you see in the upper right are the most recognized tobacco brand among the population, Marlboro, and they're all talking about how they plant trees and they're good for the environment. And so they were appealing, that's why they're high up on the chart, but the girls were saying, you know, I don't believe that tobacco companies are good for the environment. So there was a lot of counter-arguing. So that would be something in that upper left. I was encouraged to see that this brand, Red Sun, their ad is more is better. So they basically say we have more nicotine than any other brand on the market, and that's their marketing strategy, and it creates a lot of disgust. There's no arguing. And the most popular ad was the one you see in the upper left, which showed a bunch of teenagers laughing and joking. So again, no counter-arguing. That made sense to them, and it was an appealing ad. So then that helps us understand what's a more effective mode of ads. So that just gives you some ideas of what neuroscience can do in this space. I'm going to shift gears, and I'm actually going to return to an example that Nico brought up earlier today, which was misinformation correction. And so this is data from Adam Berinsky, and he was interested in this whole issue of, is Obama a U.S. citizen? And so, of course, there was a big debate in the U.S. about he wasn't a U.S. citizen, he couldn't legitimately be president. And of course, what was the conservative argument? If this guy would only release his birth certificate, this whole discussion would be over and we would be fine. Well, guess what? He did. In April of 2011, he released the birth certificate. And I draw your attention to some numbers here. You'll see that before the release of the birth certificate, 55% of Americans thought he was a U.S. citizen and 15% thought he wasn't. And what's interesting is a year later, 55% of Americans think he's a U.S. citizen and 20% think he's not, right? So you actually had more people thinking he was not a U.S. citizen after he released the birth certificate. And you'll see those intermediate numbers. You know, the issue there is right after the release of the birth certificate, more people believe the information that's been corrected, but then what happens? Over time, people start counter-arguing, and as they counter-argue, they get practiced at rejecting the truthful information you've exposed to them, and this is how they become more solidified, right? So when you're thinking you have this need to contest the space or correct the information, you're probably, you're definitely using the wrong tactic, right? What we need to think about is how to reframe the discussion. And of course, on the bottom there, you just see for Republicans only, you see that response for how many people believe that he is not a U.S. citizen is even stronger. So reiterating the points from the first talk today, misinformation is sticky and fact correction fades over time, and you need to avoid the boomerang in your response. So let's talk about another model of behavior change. Let's talk about reason-action theory. Reason-action theory says that a change in behavior, change in ideas, thinking, is a function of attitudes, social norms, and I multiply that by efficacy. So when you think of smoking, I might have the attitude that smoking is going to reduce my anxiety. It's going to give me cancer, right? It's going to have all these different competing attitudes. And then there's norms, right? There's, what do my parents think, right? That's one norm. What do my peer group, friends at school think? Those might be in competition with one another. So those all get into your psychology for what you're going to do. But at the end of the day, if you feel you're addicted and you have no chance of getting over smoking, it doesn't matter how much you affect attitudes and norms, you won't do anything. I don't know if they do this in Europe, but in the US around January, you see all of these free gym memberships for like a couple months, and you can get paired up with a physical trainer, right? Why? Well, they don't have to change your attitude about working out and being physically fit. They don't have to convince you that it's a social norm that people that work out are more esteemed in their community. What do they need to do? They need to say, how do you fit a workout schedule into your busy schedule? Do you know what to do when you get to the gym? So if they can model that for you, what are they doing? They're targeting your efficacy. They're helping you realize that you can actually do that, and then that will create the effect. So generally, when we think about influence strategies, we have to think about what are we going to target with a given campaign? Are we going to target attitudes, social norms, or efficacy? And there's different ways to measure that. I'll talk about another little project I did. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Asch conformity, but Solomon Asch did some very famous social psychology studies, probably really kind of branded the field. He had 3 different lines of different lengths, and he would show you a line and say, hey, is that the length of line 1, 2, or 3? Now the trick is he would have about 6 or 7 people in the room, and there'd be one subject, and the rest appeared to be subjects, but they were really confederates of the experiment and would agree on a wrong answer on a certain number of percentage of the trials. And so then he found that about a third of people, 37%, would agree on the wrong answer because of the social conformity effect. Right? So I'm showing this in my class to a student, and he says, you know what? That is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I'm going to do that on my platoon tomorrow. He was a platoon sergeant in the Army, and I'm like, dude, you can't do that to your platoon tomorrow. And he goes, no, you don't understand. I'm in the Army, and I can do that tomorrow. And I'm like, well, no, there's ethics in research. You can't just do that. And he goes, no, you don't understand. This is the U.S. Army. I'm in charge. It's happening tomorrow, right? So I said, okay, well, like, maybe you should make it good at least, right? So he took social network data, right, that he had, and he identified who were the central actors and who were the peripheral actors in the network to see if they would have a difference in conformity. Now, he didn't show them lines because that would be silly, but in the U.S. Army, you go to a promotion board, and part of your points for promotion are based on your knowledge of military trivia. So we put up some trivia questions. This shows you the social network. There was one of who was respected and one of who was friends. I forget which is which. And this kind of shows you the node size by their relative rank, so prestige there. And this shows you 4 of the nodes that were selected as central and peripheral. And this is my favorite question that was asked of the conformity. So I'll give you a chance to read that. If you're not laughing, there's either something lost in translation or you're not reading it, because that's funny, right? So let me help you. A tourniquet is like if you have a vein spurting blood, you like take something like and you like wrench it down so that they don't lose blood. So what happens when you do that to a neck, right? Right. So, but yes, people conformed to the wrong answer on this question. In fact, the people that were central, well, who do you think? Who do you think conformed? The people that were central or peripheral? How many, let me just show by show of hands, how many people think that the central people conformed? 1, 2. How many people think that the peripheral people conformed? Most. Well, you are more insightful than me, because I actually thought the central people were going to be the conformists, but no, it was of the central actors, one of them conformed to 2 questions out of 15, the others didn't at all, and the peripheral actors conformed 13 to 15 times of the targeted question. And so then I had to go and get, I did all the proper ethical approvals and such, and repeated this on a number of other groups, and found that we had very consistent findings, and that we had about a negative 0.84 correlation between centrality and conformity. So it actually becomes the most explanatory factor for social conformity is your position in the network. So when you are isolated in the network, right, you have a much greater pressure to conform to social pressures than if you are central in that social network. I then looked at a variation of that where I took an infantry brigade that was going to Afghanistan, and so they were going to be kind of in isolated groups, and we gave them full psychometric evaluations before their deployment, 2 to 3 months into their deployment to Afghanistan, and then post-deployment. And we found that the most explanatory factor to PTSD, suicide, or depression, and unfortunately suicide was social isolation in the network. In fact, so much so that when you control for social isolation, direct combat exposure had no effect on PTSD whatsoever. Now, of course, that doesn't sound very good, does it? Because we can have empathy for somebody that's seen horrors and seen, terrible things. But if somebody's just lonely, right, that doesn't seem like a satisfying explanation. It's like, go make a friend, right? But loneliness is probably one of the more important mental health drivers of anything. And there's actually a well-known paradox, friendship paradox, which on average, your friends have more friends than you, right? And that's a mathematical fact. In fact, the only time your friends, on average, don't have more friends than you is if you know exactly the same people, in which case everybody has the exact same. But if there's any diversity in the network, your friends, on average, have more friends than you. And if you are curious about that, you can Google the friendship paradox, and you can see a very nice little video from some people at MIT that will explain it to you. And it's worth the time. So, so we see that not only does social isolation drive conformity, right, but it drives, there's this biological need, right? It actually causes mental health issues if you don't conform and get the social acceptance you're looking for. I'll introduce another issue with networks. So this is the majority illusion by Lerman and colleagues. And so you see two networks here. And what that's representing is a view that people might have. So you can see that the red nodes have a minority view. Well, you don't get to poll the entire network. You only get to talk to the people in your neighborhood, right? That's the typical scenario. And so if you look at the network on the left, network on the right, same network, right? Same number of nodes hold the minority opinion. But what I'm showing you on the right is the percentages, right, the proportion of neighbors that hold the minority view. And so you see that the network on the left, everybody except 3 nodes believe that at least half of the people in the network are having the minority view, whereas the people on the right have this, this accurate view. And so that's an example of what we'd say with the network on the left is that they have this majority, or this majority illusion, where they think that the red nodes are overrepresented based on their view of the network. And this occurs with 2 network properties. One is the degree, the number of connections that the minority opinion has, and the level of assortativity. Do high degree nodes talk to other high degree nodes or to low degree nodes, right? So in that situation where you have a high degree node connected to a lot of low degree nodes having the minority opinion, you get this majority illusion. Where do we see that? On social media? With celebrities. Celebrities are high degree nodes, typically followed by a lot of people that have much smaller networks, and the celebrity opinion is often probably a majority illusion, as we see with recent US elections and other issues. Why is the majority illusion so important? Well, it's this social psychology concept of pluralistic ignorance. People's perception of the social norm is not driven by what the actual normative value is, but by their perception of the norm. So the example where that's most empirically used is in college students, because that's where professors get to survey people and ask them their views. And so they'll ask them about college drinking. How many beers on average do you have at a party? And you know, a typical college student will say, well, about 3 to 4. And you'll say, well, how much do your friends drink at the party? And they'll typically say about 6 to 8. Right? So everybody in college thinks that the peers are drinking twice as much as them and having twice as much promiscuous sex and doing twice as much drugs. And so that leads them to do more drinking, more drugs, and more promiscuous sex in college. And then when they leave, they resume, I guess, a moderate level of those activities, right? So the pluralistic ignorance and the network effects that you have online, right, are an important consideration in how that shapes normative values and then persuasion. I'll talk a little bit about how social media companies use these theories to engineer their search optimization algorithms. So I had a student that went through a bunch of, so Twitter won't tell you how they engineer their algorithms, but I had a really creative student that went through a ton of different blogs, news reports, Wired magazine, etc., and any place she could find an interview with a Twitter engineer, and they would ask them questions. She kind of pieced together all of the items that they said they would incorporate in their algorithm. We don't know the relative weights, but there were 29 factors. And we kind of grouped these factors into 6 categories. And so, like you might imagine, in the upper right, the tweet popularity, right? So how many times is the tweet retweeted, favorited, clicked on? And yes, they can estimate the time you spend reading the tweet. That affects it. Any kind of media, if you attach video, images, or links, your tweet is going to be more visible than if you lack those. The engagements, so if I have a relationship with you, if I've liked your content and retweeted your content, then my content will be more likely to appear in your feed because we have that relationship, right? The recency of the media, the pattern of life, time of day, shared connections. If you are in a networked ecosystem, you will have much greater connection than that. And then audience behavior is, of course, what it is. And so the point here is that viewership takes more than a message. And when you look at, like, our colleague downstairs was talking about white helmets, and if you look at white helmet content and the Russian response and the Syrian civil defense response to those organizations, you'll find that the Russian response is much more networked. They have many more accounts that are liking each other's content and taking advantage of these features, which amplify their messaging on a factor of about 300 to 1 over any kind of Western media response in that space. So what I would say is we need to stop our myopic focus on how well crafted the text of a single tweet is that nobody's going to read and nobody's going to see, and think about how we can tell narratives, how we can have many accounts all liking each other, sharing each other's content, so that we get that networked ecosystem so that we too can have an amplified message that can maybe compete with the disinformation. I'll give you another example as we're talking about tweets is bots. And so when we were doing some research on Twitter and firestorms, which is the polite way of saying, another type of storm, the large negative word of mouth campaign, we looked at some user timelines. And so we found that in the user timelines, there were two interesting spikes. One about the time that people discovered Twitter, and the other in January of 2017 when somebody was inaugurated president. And so then we looked at the patterns of these accounts, and you'll see that the distributions there show overlaps between followers, friends, and number of posts. And so you'll see the kind of typical normal behavior occurs there in that intersection. And all of those metrics for the new accounts in that January spike fell way to the left. And so essentially what this means is there's accounts that have thousands of followers that never say anything. Why would you follow an account that never says anything? So we did some network analysis on that and found that they had created an ecosystem of activity that creates enhanced majority illusion, optimizes the Twitter search engine so that they can amplify content, and then one of my students trying to get a date with a staffer for a senator decided to look at the politicians up for re-election, which possibly makes him like my nerdiest friend that I have. But he found that they were following every Democrat congressman up for re-election and none of the Republicans. And so I have not gotten that published. I believe it's been banned by Twitter engineers. I actually had a colleague that was doing a project for the FBI and delivered the findings in the paper, and the FBI gave a court order to Twitter to suspend those dormant bots, which resulted in a 7% reduction in Twitter accounts, about 500 million links that were, follower links dropped, and a 23% drop in their stock prices, which I totally should have short sailed, but I was not paying attention. And that resulted in some coincidental significant changes to their terms of use, and they have not approved any of our requests to get access to data again. So, interesting phenomena, right? And that leads to thinking on what does that mean that a large social media company that apparently had a definite position to affect U.S. elections, right, and information that they did not want to release because of their business model. And what does that say about the transparency of data, the ability for people to research, investigate? Should they be allowed to do that? These are some interesting questions. I'm running short on time, so I'm going to skip through these. These were just some slides on differences in user content versus what NATO produced, and kind of showing, again, some issues of the the volume of NATO engagements, right, in the ecosphere of people talking about NATO on social media, you find is much smaller than the larger discussion. And again, it's just arguing for let's stop getting myopically worried about the text of a tweet and start thinking about what are the broader narratives, what are the frames that we're going to use, and how do we think about liking each other's posts and content and actually creating an ecosphere that promotes our content a little better. So here are some takeaways. Misinformation is sticky, it's hard to change. Countering misinformation often creates a boomerang effect. You need to design your influence campaigns, if you're going to influence, deliberately thinking about counter-arguing and how you can disrupt that. The social networks matter, and so I see most of the work still in the social media space. They don't look at networks because they're hard to calculate. They're large, they're big, and so they need a little bit more research in that area to figure out how we can take advantage of that. But we do know that they definitely matter for these problems that we're looking at. And the online viewership takes a lot more than your message, and I think the bots, I didn't really develop this argument too much because I skipped through the last couple slides, but the bots are more effective at shaping the environment than they are at actually delivering the message. So we get really concerned about what the bots are saying or not saying, I think we should be more concerned about what type of ecosphere are the bots creating, and how does that affect other content that's going on in the information environment. So thank you for your time, and I guess I'll be available for questions.